Welcome to It's No Secret, a podcast for Kiwis who want their money questions answered.
Ready, steady, go.
This podcast will answer the money questions you may or may not have on your mind. We'll talk to real Kiwis and share truths about our own financial lives.
Both the successes and the failures. Because the truth is, there is no secret to achieving financial freedom.
Hello and welcome to It's No Secret. I'm Christine.
And I'm Kat.
And today on the podcast, we are tackling the question of how do I figure out how to buy a house? Regardless of where you live, the idea of owning your own home is probably on your wish list, or it has been at some point. Us Kiwis love investing in property, and fair enough. After all, investing in property has worked really well for us. Often with ideas such as owning a property, it can be a faraway goal that we know we want, but we don't actually know how to go about getting there. Or perhaps we've come to realise that we're at that point and we're ready to figure out what the actual process is to get on the ladder. So how do we do that exactly? First, let's dive into what society tells us about owning a home. So I guess putting a Kiwi glance on that, in New Zealand, it's that you really need to own a home before you're 30. And I think there's a common conception that you're quote unquote a success if you do, because you've kind of made it to have the Kiwi dream. Would you say that's probably correct? Is that applicable for Oz too, you think?
Definitely. Oh, yeah. I don't know what the exact age is, but there's definitely that kind of pressure of like, whatever that, you're an adult, so you need to have like checked that box.
It is that age. It's like you're adulting well. Congrats.
Correct. Done.
Yeah. And then I guess on the same vein, there's also the idea that it is now in the low interest rate environment that we're in really hard to get on the ladder, and that perhaps millennials or Gen Z or just generally younger people will never be able to get on the ladder or find it increasingly hard without the help of their parents or generational wealth. And then on the flip side, there is the perception that rent is kind of dead money. So if you're renting, you're wasting the money, and why should you be paying someone else's mortgage when you could be doing your own?
That's such a simple throwaway line that we don't agree with, by the way, but just for the record, but it is a very common talking point in society and news media.
Yeah, I feel like it's very easy to attach to of, why I do that because it's so emotive. But yeah. Then there's also finally the idea that society tells us that servicing a mortgage is as hard as getting on the property ladder, which is a misconception, particularly in today's low interest rate environment. So following on from that, a good progression is, where are we at, Kat and I? Kat, where are you at? You've talked multiple times about being on the property ladder, so perhaps give us an overview of your experience with buying property.
So right now I am a homeowner. We own the house or the unit that we live in Auckland, and this wasn't actually our first property that we purchased. If I'm including Luke in the which I am, our property journey started before we had sort of combined finances, and he actually went in to buy a property with two other family members. So his first foray into property was when he was still living in Melbourne, and they bought a house that he had a 1/3 share in New Zealand with some family members. They rented that out, kept that for a number of years. And then after we'd been together for a couple of years and we had like a trigger point change in our lives, which made us think about starting to get on the property ladder, which I think is sometimes when it happens, right? Like something happens in your life that kind of all of a sudden makes you think that like now's the time I need to maybe start thinking about this goal. That's what happened. And the trigger point for me was I had received a small inheritance from my grandma. It was about $25,000 to $30,000 from memory. And I just thought, I have this money, I may as well see what I can do with it. So we looked at that. We ended up buying an investment property in Melbourne rather than a home to live in, because we couldn't afford to buy in the area that we wanted to buy, which I'm sure we will talk about later. And then we kept that house. We had actually intended to keep it for a really long time. So, 10 plus years kind of thing was the plan with investment property, as I guess most investment properties are. The reason that we ended up selling it, let's say I'm going to say roughly 4 years later, was because when we became tax residents in New Zealand, there were some tax changes that were quite punitive against Australians living outside of Australia. So that was our prompting factor. We had kind of a window of opportunity to sell it before those tax rules came into place. So we did sell the house. And yeah, and then in the meantime, I guess, so whilst we still owned the other house in Melbourne, in the meantime, we bought our house in Auckland. And again, very much one of those things, like something happens in your life. It was absolutely not on the radar. We had no intention to own a home here. In the short term, it wasn't even on our goals. And the reason that it came about was because our landlord called us one day to tell us that we would need to move out because she was selling the unit that we lived in. And so, being the financial planner I literally crunched the numbers on a spreadsheet like half an hour after we hung up. And then I called her back and I was like, if you can give me 2 weeks, I want to see if we can make an offer on the house. And so they were nice enough that they gave us 2 weeks to basically see if we could afford it. We hadn't even thought, we didn't even know how to get a loan in New Zealand kind of thing. So we were very lucky that they agreed to give us 2 weeks to kind of think through that. And then it transpired that, yeah, we ended up being able to make an offer and they accepted that. And that's currently where we live. And then, of course, long-time listeners of the show would know since then we have sold the 2 investment properties. So we sold the house in Melbourne and we also sold earlier this year the investment property that Luke had a 1/3 share in. So currently just one house, and I gotta say it's a lot easier. It's a lot easier. A lot of less life admin going on here. So yeah. But it is funny because I think like on the first home buyer front, like I remember distinctly having all of that kind of anticipation, particularly in Melbourne when we were first going through the process of thinking like we're never going to be able to afford in the suburb that we want to live and how we're going to be able to do this, and then kind of being like, okay, just renting and having an investment property somewhere else is our future. And then we never really knew how we would get to this point. So I feel quite lucky that we are now in the situation that we are, I guess, without having like an active plan around it, so to speak. But I think that also speaks to the fact that you never really know what's going to happen in the future. And as long as you're the type of person that's open, I guess, to opportunities and, you know, doing something good with your finances, then oftentimes you can find things pop up along the way.
Yeah, definitely. I'm really curious because I've never actually asked you this, but
yeah.
When you went into buying your first home, so obviously you said you bought it as an investment property, did you have all those kind of preconceived ideas of, I want my first home to be X and I want it to look like this and la la la, I want to live in this suburb? Or were you quite open to...
Look, we did, but I think that was tainted by the fact that my parents lived, and at the time I was living in a suburb that they've literally lived in Melbourne there like my entire life. We've never moved suburbs. So I was very much like, you know, I want to live within that kind of area, which really narrowed down our geographical range, right? And I knew how much we would have to spend a house. I think back then probably, you know, we easily could have spent sort of $700,000, $800,000 buying a place there. And I just knew straight off the bat that I was like, well, I've got a $30,000 inheritance. Like, this sure as shit ain't getting me a deposit to an $800,000 house. Don't need a calculator to figure that one out. So I think very quickly that was removed off the table as an option. Then we felt like quite good about, I was like quite excited about buying an investment property and thinking like, oh, you know, this could be like a new challenge. But what we did really have to reconcile with is, you know, even in my mind, I was like, oh, you know, like a $600,000 investment property, $550,000. And then very quickly, all the numbers on the broker we worked with and stuff came back and they were like, yeah, your price cap's $450,000. And I was like, that's going to buy us a garage in Melbourne. You know, like I was kind of, I don't know, just the actual reality of being told that number and being like, you can't buy any more. And then also, so being told that number by the broker that we were working with, I guess, is our affordability metric. And then taking that to, we were using a property advocate to help us source an investment property because we were obviously buying in an area like out of Melbourne that we had never lived in and we didn't really know anything about and we didn't feel very confident doing that. So we got a property advocate to help us with that purchase and telling them, oh, you know, this is our limit. And then they're like, okay, so you've got a choice of 2 suburbs, you know, out of the whole of Melbourne kind of thing.
So you basically have to move to Sydney now.
Yeah, like it was a pretty stark reality, you know, and I think then very quickly just having all of your expectations wiped off the table really humbles you. And we were kind of like, okay, well, the choice then, I guess, at that point was like, don't buy a property or buy it. And we just felt like we should still buy it, even if it was not what we had originally imagined. And I don't regret like any of that. Like, it, you know, it was in an area that to be fair, I probably wouldn't live in. It was a lovely area, just very different kind of fair way out of kind of like Melbourne CBD and the areas that I went to for work and like socializing and all that kind of stuff, and just a very different neighborhood. And we spent a lot of time there because we did end up doing renovations on the house, and it was lovely, but it was just, we were just super naive.
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, and probably everyone is when they're buying their first home. I definitely fit in that bucket.
Yes. Yes. So you guys don't have a home, and I feel like, yes, you've been in like a full circle on this recently.
Yeah. So I guess for anyone listening for the first time, my partner and I do not own a home. I don't think my family has ever owned a home, so it's not really something that we've talked about doing and I'm familiar with. So recently, Ollie and I kind of went through the process of getting sucked into the property FOMO and went to one open home, saw a mortgage advisor, and then just kind of had the harsh reality that our cap was around sort of, I mean, to make the mortgage serviceable, like 800, 850, 900, depending on how far we were willing to push it, which can't really buy you a lot in Auckland. And if we were to buy a property, that's where we would do it. Yes, we could do what Kat just said, but the conclusion that we came to is that we would prefer to keep investing in shares and then wait a little bit longer, grow our money that way, and then buy the first home that we want to live in for 10 years. I think, for us, we're not that crazy on property, so it's just a different perspective. I think I'm being sold more the more I talk to people about it, but
it is interesting though, right? Because I think as well, like, looking back to when we bought that house, it wasn't really on my radar that I had another option. Like it was kind of like, oh, if you don't want to buy a house right now, you could just take this money that you've received as an inheritance and that you've saved, and you could go and invest it. And I didn't really have that on our radar because I think it's still, head was so permeated with the whole, like, to be successful, you've got to get on the property ladder and you've got to do that really quickly. And also, I think, for anyone that has received money as a gift or through inheritance before, there's often quite a lot of expectation with that, and you put a lot of pressure on yourself to do something with it that's good. And I think I had kind of just tied buying a property and doing that together. Whereas now, if I was, faced with the situation, or like I think of my brother who's 5 years younger than me and he's not on the property ladder, and he's a similar age now than say I was then, I'd probably say to him, like, go and invest, give yourself flexibility. Like, there's absolutely not one path to wealth.
Yeah, definitely.
But we're here to talk about property, guys.
Yeah.
So we'll scrap the investment chat with
I was going to say, for context, anyone, Kat and I came into this episode knowing that we were going to go on so many tangents, and we were like, we need to be strict on time.
If, like Christine recently, you have gotten to the point where maybe you've had a trigger point in your life, or you've started to have conversations with your partner, or if you're doing this solo, you've really started to take it a bit more seriously and you're now thinking about, okay, I do want to buy a house, what is the process that you need to go through to either figure out how close to that goal you are, and then if you are quite close, what are the actual steps you need to go through in terms of finding how to do that and get a mortgage and all that kind of stuff. So Christine, do you want to kind of kick us off, because you guys obviously went through this recently? So what did you sort of start with, and what was the first step that you sort of took?
Yeah, great question. So I mean, I'm just going to mention the step because it's not what we started with, but it's probably important, is to consider your timeline. So do you want to be buying a house in a year, 3 years, 5 years? What are you kind of working with here? And perhaps can you be flexible on that timeline? So, is that set in stone, or can you, have some leeway on that? So, I mean, Ollie and I went into this process knowing, with a flexible timeline, quite open-minded. So what we did first was we did sort of a financial check, and we had a look at actually how much money do we have saved up and what is the reality of our situation, because I mean, that's kind of the starting point for the whole process, really.
Yep.
And then what is that actually going to buy us? So, how much of a mortgage do we need before we go looking at, like, should I buy in the city or out of the city or whatever? It's how much of a mortgage can we service? So that's where we started, and we came to the conclusion, as I said before, it was roughly around 800 mark. And then from there, I'll come back to the actual process, but we thought it would be a good idea to go talk to a mortgage advisor to also have them help us with that process a little bit and be realistic around how much, like, what are the rates for mortgages and what's the serviceability that they see and what are the options around that. And I think after having a conversation with her around that, it not scared us a little bit, but we were like, okay, we're not really ready for this step yet. We did go to an open home, and that also was a nice reality check in that what you can buy for that much isn't a lot. So yeah, through doing a little bit of research, it made us realize that perhaps we are wanting to draw that out a little bit. But we went about it a little bit of a weird way. So, I mean, what's a better way to do it, Kat?
I think what you said at the start is a great starting point. So, basically doing an audit of your own current financial situation. So, how much do you already have saved? Are you planning to use your Kiwis saver? What's that total sum that could go towards a deposit? And I think that's typically what most people have in mind as a starting point. But then you need to take that amount that is your deposit and figure out, okay, well, if this is a 20% deposit, what's the 80% number that the bank could potentially loan to me? And therefore, what's the possible purchase price that I can be looking at? Once you have those two numbers, so what your 80% loan is and what your potential purchase price is, I guess to your point, Christine, you've probably got enough information there to start researching a little bit to kind of sense check it immediately at that point. So, if your purchase price is, say, as you said, 800,000, and then you very quickly realize that in the area that you'd ideally like to buy, you probably need to be spending $1 million. Okay, let's regroup, discuss, and perhaps you stop the process at that point. If, however, you find that your purchase price, based on what deposit you've got saved, is achievable for the area that you want to buy, then you can kind of take that next step of, okay, well, this is what the bank could lend me, I guess, or I would need them to lend me based on my deposit. And then when you have that chat with the mortgage broker, the purpose of that is, okay, on paper, you want them to lend that 80%, but is the bank actually going to want to lend you that 80% based on, your income, your other debt levels, your student loan, if you have one, your expenses, all that type of stuff. So that's where you kind of need this next step. Now, I guess before we get too far down that rabbit hole, there's probably some people that are thinking wait, do I have to have a 20% deposit? And it is worthwhile mentioning that you don't in all scenarios. It's the generally recommended for, an existing home. A bank will be ideally looking for you to have a 20% deposit, but there are scenarios where they will accept a 10% deposit and then very few scenarios where they'll accept a 5% home deposit. And of course, that's mostly in relation to new build or off the plan turnkey properties that they're trying to incentivize in terms of the supply. Yeah, the supply of the housing market more. So you'll hear, I guess, the ideal amount to get to is 20%, but you may be able to afford on less. One thing to probably mention on that, though, is there are times where if you have less than 20%, you might need to pay what's called lender's mortgage insurance, which is basically an additional cost that you pay to the bank as insurance on the fact that you're kind of more of a higher risk lender. How that works in practice can vary, but in the way that I've experienced it, they can capitalize that onto the total mortgage. So let's say your total mortgage was going to be $800,000 and you had some LMI of say $25,000, they will often add that $25,000 to the $800,000 and you'll pay that off over the course of the loan. But that's something to keep in mind as well.
That's interesting. I didn't know that, actually. Fun fact.
Yeah, I've got a fun fact on that, actually, because that's sort of, I guess, when we get to the point of well, what should I do if you don't have a 20% deposit? This is a conversation that we had when we did buy that first house in Melbourne, because so I must have had about $45,000 in total, and that was roughly 10% if they'd told us that our purchase price could be roughly $450,000. Now, then we had the discussion of the fact that we would have to pay lender's mortgage insurance. And for me, I know, so people approach this in different ways, because some people are like, well, it's a cost that you pay to get into the housing market sooner, and the growth of the house is going to outweigh that cost in the long term. And that's a fair thing. But then it just pained me because I was like, no, we're just paying extra money to the bank. What a waste. So one of the suggestions that our broker made to us was, well, can you get from a family resource, if possible, the additional 10% loaned to you by them so that you have a total 20%. So you're not paying LMI to the bank, but then you are repaying that loan from your family member. So that's what we ended up doing. Rather than going down the path of, say, my parents going guarantor on a loan, they ended up loaning us the additional 10% deposit. So let's say whatever that is, $45,000. And we then paid them interest back on that over time.
That makes sense. That's good.
Yeah, which I kind of liked because it's a lot cleaner. And yeah, meant for me at least instant win that no lender's mortgage insurance. But other people look at that and they're like, oh, it's just a cost of buying a house. It's fine. So I guess it's for courses.
And I guess if you are in the same camp in that you do see it as an expense, it's, I guess, about extending your timeline to be able to then save up the 20%.
Definitely.
If borrowing from family isn't an option for you.
Yeah. And I think that's definitely important to note because, a lot of people, I think when they're going down the first home buying path is, they get to the deposit and then all of a sudden get really disheartened because perhaps their KiwiSaver and savings are very far off the amount that they need to get to. And, if that's you in this scenario, I guess our general kind of suggestions is sort of Christine has gone through is like, well, okay, can you extend your timeline? Like, do you need to buy in 2 years' time or can you buy in 5 years' time? Are there other things that you can do with that money in the meantime as perhaps just against, saving it? Is it something that you can look towards investing towards that property deposit? Do you have family that you could call on if that's an option to you? If you're looking at doing this singularly, the unfortunate reality for a lot of people is that they defer home ownership until they're perhaps as a couple because it is a lot easier once you've got two sets of finances to even achieve that. Or, if you're really, really keen on it, it's like, well, just look at it at a different area, buying in a different area and making it, like you have to make the compromise somewhere, right?
Yeah, definitely. I
think the thing with first home ownership, whilst it may look like this on Instagram sometimes, is I guarantee you no first homeowner buys their dream home. It just doesn't exist.
Unless you wait for 50 years and then buy it.
Unless you win the lottery.
Yeah, and then by that time you've got enough for the whole cost of the house.
Exactly. So I think it's about re-examining your expectations, resetting what you need to be working towards. So then I guess on mortgage serviceability, CJ, I know that you guys have obviously gone through this because this was a big part of your research and maybe this was the point that you kind of got turned off from the whole process. So do you want to talk us through, okay, if we're happy with our deposit and we think this is good, how do we then figure out mortgage serviceability?
Yeah, for sure. So Ollie and I kept it really simple in that we talked to the mortgage advisor, but then there's so many tools online that you can use to do a very basic analysis of this. And so for the purpose of this podcast, I used a Kiwibank one that I found. And essentially I plugged in the house price of $900,000, which gave me a 20% deposit of $180,000, which was then resulting in a loan of $720,000. So then that also was based on a 25-year term, an interest rate of 2.95. So all of this calculated then to show me that it would be paying $781 per week, which is $1,562 per fortnight. So that's a very simple way that you can do it. When I look at those numbers, $781 between the two of us, while that may not seem like a lot, I guess by Auckland standards, and that, that's $300 and I don't know, $70 each or something like that.
Yeah.
That's without rates, it's without insurance, all that kind of stuff. So that doesn't include any of those expenses. And that is the point that we got to where we were like, okay, maybe we can't afford to service this. Yep. And so then we did kind of play around, well, what if we adjusted some of those things? So the loan term, we could change that. What if we change the interest rate? I mean, there's not a huge amount of wiggle room there. And then also the cost of the house, right? So I guess it's just trying to readjust and play around with those numbers to see what works for you or how perhaps you could make it work for you.
Definitely.
Yeah. Would you add anything to that?
No, I think that's absolutely key. And I would definitely suggest doing this before you then go and see a broker, because I think, as I know that you guys both have a really thorough understanding of your budget, but I would definitely say that, if you don't have that now, that is absolutely key before even starting this process, because the first question a broker's going to ask you is how much do you get paid and what are your expenses? So, sometimes you may not even need to get to the point of discussing it with them, you can kind of play around first and see where you're comfortable with. Also, I think understanding your income. So, are you a payee employee and it's actually very straightforward, or are there more complicated circumstances in your situation, i.e., are you a contractor? Are you self-employed? Do you have overseas income? I think that's worth mentioning because, of course, there's lots of Kiwis moving back to New Zealand, and there's still the option to, contract work for overseas businesses, but it is worthwhile thinking through those things. And if you have unique situations, 100% talk about it with a broker, because there's a lot of nuances with the serviceability side for that. So I guess as an example just on that, like when we went through the lending process to buy our house in Mount Eden, at the time I was contracting from an Australian company, getting paid Australian dollars into an Australian bank account, and the bank would only factor in, I think from memory, it was like 60% of my income because it was foreign sourced income, even though all of that money was being transferred to New Zealand and they could see it coming into like our New Zealand bank account every month. They wouldn't include the full 100%, and it drove me nuts because I was like, why? This is so ridiculous. And I didn't want to quit my job to like go and get better mortgage serviceability. So just those sorts of things that we'd never encountered that before, and we didn't realize what kind of a challenge that would be. Those sorts of things actually meant that we ended up only getting a loan with one bank that was particularly favourable and understood that sort of arrangement, as opposed to some of the other standard banks just were really like, nah, didn't want to touch it. So definitely that kind of thing. And then I guess on what the banks want to see, it is kind of the simple stuff of they will look through at least the last 6 months of your income and spending. They'll usually request actually fully downloaded bank statements so that they will trawl through, and they pay people at the bank to actually go and look how much you have spent on Afterpay and Uber Eats and other things like that. So they'll be looking for your history of your ability to save or not spend beyond your means. Of course, they'll be looking at all of your other debts, things like credit card debts, personal debts, car loans, student loans, looking at all of that stuff. Now, one of the things that I've personally learned from working with a number of brokers, both in Australia and New Zealand, is the benefit of working with a broker is that their job is to present your best case scenario to the best bank that's most likely to approve you. So we have been through the scenario of like blindly just rocking up to a bank being like, yeah, they're going to approve us for a mortgage. And then them being like, no. And then after the fact, finding out that actually it was because we did not present the best version of Cat and Luke. We presented just a normal version of Cat and Luke, which didn't really do us any favors. So that's why I guess, finding a broker that can help you is worth their weight in gold, because that's essentially what they're doing. They are aware of what difference there's like various banks think about different things, and where they can perhaps massage the story about you and why you would be a good customer to the bank. That's what they're doing, and it's very important.
I was going to add in there, and I think this is the perfect segue into, I guess, the next step of, when you're looking for a mortgage broker. You touched on going prepared with your budget and ensuring that you're kind of clear on what your range is for that house price. So, yeah, I guess this was a learning from Ollie and I that, we don't feel comfortable pushing that limit to 1.2 million or whatever. And I think that was a little bit something that we didn't agree with the mortgage advisor, or because we weren't so firm on it going in, that person wanted to encourage us to go higher. If you understand that beforehand, you can be really solid in what is going to support you. And noting that, perfect segue, mortgage brokers get paid by the bank, not you. So they're on a commission. So it's really important to make sure that they have your best interests in mind and also understand your situation and what's going to work for you, not necessarily drive their commission.
Absolutely. And I think a big part of that is making sure that they are putting to you a loan with a bank that suits your needs and is not perhaps just the bank that's the easiest for them to deal with or they're fastest for them to approve a loan, unless, of course, that's important. So, the types of things that you want to be talking to your mortgage broker about is how you need the loan to be structured. How do you guys get paid? Are you on fortnightly repayments, weekly, monthly? What does that look like? Do you need other accounts? Do you have savings? Therefore, could you look at perhaps structures like offset accounts or other things? Like there's lots of different options. So if they're not engaging in that conversation with you, you need to come at them with, well, this is how we want to use our accounts. This is ideally how we'd like to have them set up. Can you make sure that we're with a bank that easily facilitates that?
That's a really good point about the repayments. I didn't think of that.
Yes.
That's a good one.
And I think it's the little things like that. It's really, really good to have your ideal goal in mind before you go and see them, in addition with all of your kind of budget and everything sussed out, because whilst they may not have the ideal outcome for you, you need to come at them with the requests, because they're otherwise not going to know ultimately how, they won't know how you and Ollie set up all your bank accounts and do your transfers and prefer to do stuff. So you really need to come with that information for them so they can help you and be demanding. Like, heck, I was so demanding with our broker. I was like, no, we had to win this. Like, this is a non-negotiable. I was just like, cut the bull. Like, these are my demands. Sort it out.
I can only imagine. I would love to be a fly on the wall.
I think it's just because I know that I do think that brokers are worth their weight in gold, but I guess the thing with just the whole property industry in general is like, they're busy, they're under the pump, it moves fast. You don't want to be left behind kind of thing. You just probably need to come at it like prepared to not be a wallflower.
Yeah, that was a learning from me as well. Like, have a backbone.
Yeah, get the outcome that you want. Otherwise, particularly in this market in, say, Auckland or New Zealand, right? Like, there's plenty of people lining up at the door trying to buy houses. So you really need to go in and back for yourself.
I think there's also that part of, like wasting their time in a way. So be really sure that you are ready to do it.
Do your homework, and then they will take you seriously. I think
exactly. And then perhaps you can move fast and be firm in what you want in that regard, right?
Absolutely. And ultimately, like, the other thing to keep in mind, if you are then getting to the scenario where you're getting pretty close, like, your deposit's looking good, that's ticked that box, your budget looking good, you've checked your serviceability, you're like, yep, I'm pretty sure we can do this, and you actually want them to help you get pre-approval and start being able to assist you, for, say, auctions and those sorts of things. Like, you do have to have a good, fast relationship with them where they're going to prioritize you over other people if you are successful, and, there might only be a 30-day turnaround. You need to make sure that you're able to move for stuff like that. So helping them as much as you can so that they can help you when it actually counts will absolutely pay off.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's also an important distinction to make. So between, I guess, a mortgage broker and a financial advisor, that's perhaps something that you might find out from going to one, hopefully not, but understanding whether do you want a mortgage advisor to buy a house, or do you need some help with your goals? Because you don't want to go to a mortgage advisor and then be like, oh, do I want to buy a house?
I'm not really sure.
Which is what I did.
Think that's good. That is an important thing to think about, like coming back to your very first point, Christine, of think about your time horizon and think about what the goal is. And if the discussion that you ultimately want to have is, how do I get to buying a house? That's not really a conversation that you want to be having with a mortgage broker. That's a conversation that you want to be having with a financial advisor or a budgeting coach or someone like that. You really need to be seeing the mortgage broker when you're pretty certain that at some point in the next, say, 12 to 18 months, or even shorter than that, 12 months, you're going to be using their services to help you get a loan because you're actively getting into the market.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Thanks for joining us for part 1 of How Do I Buy a Property? This ended up being quite a lengthy discussion, as you can probably tell, so we've broken today's episode into 2 parts. We hope you enjoyed the first portion, and the second part will be dropping later this week, so tune in then. In the meantime, you can jump on itsnosecret.co.nz/25 for some really great resources and links to things around deposits and mortgage calculators, or get in touch with us on the gram at itsnosecretnz. Chat soon.